purpose of the business cannot be separated from the purpose of the leader. And I say this because there's a distinction between the leader themselves as a person and their purpose and the purpose of that business.
Hello and welcome once again to another episode of The Truth in Development. This is a podcast powered by Ntiyiso Consulting Group, and I've been engaged in a number of conversations with the group chief advisor, Mr. Ntiyiso, about a number of business concepts. We've discussed the idea of strategy as a value bringer in and of itself. We've discussed issues around what is value. We've discussed what does it mean to have a customer-centric value proposition. Today, we have a conversation that is going to focus on how do we create the organizations that harbor those concepts in order to deliver businesses that are successful. And to have that conversation with me is the group chief advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group, and that is Mr. Andisa Ramabunga. Mr. Ramabunga, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start off by saying these concepts are making us think a little harder about what it means to have businesses. They are making us think a little harder about the idea that we can't just open up a shop. We can't just have a website and say that we have a business. A lot more thinking has to go into what it is that you're proposing to the market. And that's why we had that conversation around customer-centric value propositions. But I'm interested today in having a conversation about the organization, the business itself that must carry these well thought through ideas. Where do we start?
So, Aubrey, yes, look, you can open a shop. But I guess these concepts we are talking about talks about the longevity of that shop. It talks about its ability to scale and employ much more people. It talks about how profitable it can be and how does it extract that value from the market that it has started serving, and how it sees itself evolving over time. So these concepts, as I've mentioned, they are not a panacea of ideas. These are simply a checkbox list of ideas or concepts that an entrepreneur or businessman must think about. And I guess today we are going to talk about that shop that you're talking about, but what sort of an organization should it be? And it all started with crafting what strategy is as a value creator. We spoke in much more detail around what value is. And then we honed into the concept of desirability, which is around a customer-centric value proposition and what it takes to design or what to think about when you're designing one. And I guess today is where all these things intersect to say, now you've got a strategy. The strategy has got at the center customers and value propositions or problems that we're solving on behalf of these customers. And we can make money. Now, how do we build an organization that's going to carry out the mandate?
So what we are talking about today is the practical steps, the resources, the skills that are required to make that value proposal live.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
So where do we start? I mean, do we start simply by saying, listen, I'm going to hire some space in some office park, or I am going to get myself a workshop in some factory? Where do we start?
Yes. Although that's a very good start, but I would say it starts with the planning part. It starts with the thinking. Because again, should you be opening up a factory or not? Those are a function of planning. And if you are, where should it be? Again, this is a function of planning. Who would be in there and what sort of activities will be taking place in there? Does it have the capabilities to take out our product to market? Or where would the product reside? How do we reach customers and so forth? These are all organizational issues that we have to think about planning. But let me give a structured approach to thinking about the organizational design to say where do you start. Again, let me take a step back because other people might be watching this for the first time, is to say that this is a third episode in a series. And it's quite important that we talk about the other two episodes, at least summarize them. Because without you understanding at least what comes out of those two episodes, this one might be misplaced or misunderstood. We said it all started with strategy. Strategy has got three components, which is around desirability, which talks to market segments and the value that we're delivering to them. How are we managing those customers and what channels do we have to create awareness of ourselves and the products, to deliver the product to the customer, as well as managing the after-sales process. Once you have structured that very well, which is where we had that detailed conversation about value and how do you design a value proposition, you have to ask yourself, once you've completed that exercise, is to say, do I have capabilities to deliver on that value proposition? In simple business term, is we say, do you understand the work that needs to be done to advance the value proposition and deliver it to the client? Do you have the resources? This is where now you're starting to think, to say, I need machinery, I need so many type of machinery, I need this IP, I need this type of cash if you've got operational or even capex requirements. And you also need to ask yourself, are there components of the work that needs to be done? Are there components that I could outsource? And can I find strategic partners? And again, those are deep strategic questions that an entrepreneur, a business person needs to grapple with themselves, because you don't necessarily need strategic partners, but they will help in a number of ways. One, they have more experience than you do in certain areas of your value chain. They probably assist you in de-risking your business venture by allowing you some cash flow alleviation, because you might not have to pay them immediately, or they might not have something that you don't have. So it's quite important that you think strategic partners before you even start opening the shops. And then finally, it was the concept around, can we make money? From the customers, we are making revenues. From the feasibility side, we're incurring costs. Can we make a surplus from taking the revenues
to the viability.
to the viability? So from that quadrant of, or circle rather, of feasibility, we spoke about work that needs to be done. I think that's the pivotal part to start designing an organization. You asked me a very simple question that says, where do you start? First, understand what work needs to be done, right? Because that one then gets you to set up a framework to develop the organization. Once you understand what is the work you need to do to deliver a value proposition, you then need to answer three components that follow from that, which are really the elements of the organization that you're trying to design. One is, what sort of people do I need with the expertise to do the work, right? Because you need people with certain expertise, with certain qualifications and experience to carry out the work, because otherwise that work would not be carried out. And by the way, before I move too quickly, work to be done is simply what we call business processes. These are processes or the types of activities you undertake to, one, build your product, get it into market and
so these would
sell
be
it.
the key tasks.
Key tasks, yeah, critical tasks. Other people call them those. And by the way, they get confused with a competitive advantage, right? Because they believe that's where you create the competitive advantage for yourself. But I think competitive advantage for me is a facet of a lot of things. It has to do with the type of value proposition you choose to do, the types of markets you're trying to play to. So there's a whole lot of nuance. But let's take for now that you understand the work that needs to be done. You then need to answer the people element that says, what sort of people do I need here? What sort of expertise should they have? What sort of qualification background should they have? How much experience must they have? What sort of key competencies must they have? Because that's all derived from the work that needs to be done. Once you've understood the type of people, is then to answer yourself, how am I going to structure this organization? And this is where now the question of a shop being built, because where you're saying let's structure, you answer a couple of questions there. One is what does the structure of this organization look like? Who leads? Who does what? And where do we put them? And again,
Sure.
that talks to
Sure.
space. What locations do we need to be in? How do we govern this organization? By the way, if it's a one-man shop, you probably don't have that complexity of having to build a robust governance framework. But as a business grows, you do need to think about this.
But even if it
concepts.
was a one-man shop, you'd still need to have disciplines around what time do you need to be at the shop.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What time do you have lunch? What time do you open? What time do you close?
So it's discipline around money management. It's disciplines around operating hours. It's discipline about thinking about the business, because that's what governance is about. So it's not only doing. You need to have the discipline that says, from time to time, I need to take time off and reflect on the business and reassess or assess how am I doing in the various components. If my process is delivering to clients, if the people are doing what they're supposed to do, is the way that I've structured working. So you do need to build that discipline, even if you're a one-man shop. But Aubrey, I think I have made it the same point the last time, that says, I think of organizations as living mechanisms, right? They grow over time, and different times require different types of interventions. And the reason why we build these topics or concepts, it's because they are preparing you for the long route. So they are assisting you build the discipline now when you're starting out, if you are, or they are assisting you to identify the gaps if you are some point in your organizational evolution. But at some point in time, you will need to have, if you are serious about growing and scaling your business, you will need to have probably a robust governance infrastructure. But whatever topic we're talking about now, it's in the context of that organization grows.
That there's an evolutionary
evolution
path
of
that any organization has to follow as it grows, as it matures.
As it matures,
Okay.
So you have to think about structuring yourself. You have to think about governance. You have to think about information systems. I mean, at what point? And by the way, having had the privilege of starting two businesses now, it's quite easy to get overtaken by events. And it's quite important that you build the necessary awareness early on. And that's why I'm going to belabor this point, to say information systems are very critical. Because when we start businesses, those are probably the least investments we wanna do, right? Because we don't have that much money. So we tend to manage our information in a way that it's probably not secure, not easy to manage.
What information systems that pertain to what?
About the running of the business.
Okay.
Right? You need
so it's a manual.
It could be manual when you start. So, for example, orders could be in a spreadsheet, right? Receipts could be paper-based. Maybe you have not documented processes, but you at least have a bit of an understanding of the ways of work. We spoke about the people there. Remember, you need to define what work will they need to do. And again, you need to document that and make sure you store them. So these are disciplines, by the way, that might sound academic. But trust me, once your business starts growing up, they really take away the pain of managing the business. And half the fights, by the way, and we've mentioned the stats around businesses that do not last beyond a certain point. Half those fights are because we are fighting fires at some certain point in time. It's just the complexity of the organization becomes so big that to manage it becomes almost an impossible task. Right. It might be the pain at the beginning that you need to codify certain things, but trust me, it alleviates the pressure as the complexity of the business grows. I mean, think about it, Aubrey. When it's yourself, there's only one conversation to be had. It's just one of you, right? The moment there's two people, there's two conversations that needs to be had. The moment there's three people, there's 6 conversations that needs to be had. The moment there's 4 people, I think that thing exponentially grows. Right. Now the question is, how do you keep tab of those conversations? How do you know that they give or those conversations are giving advantage to you furthering your organization? So governance becomes sacrosanct, and that's why I believe at this point that organization is how you organize that thing. It's something you have to think about upfront. And with the benefit of hindsight, having started businesses, I can really advise entrepreneurs who are starting out to really think about this carefully before the business gets too complicated. Or those that have scaled to a certain level, to really take a step back and make sure that the business is codified to a certain extent. And by codification, I mean exactly just understand the structure, let it be documented. If there are job descriptions that needs to be done, do them so that people are aware. And by the way, it becomes the way that you recruit people into your business. Let's understand how the governance work. How often do we meet to plan? How often do we meet to plan the strategy, to plan the business? How often do we meet to plan the operations? How often do we review progress and successful delivery? What are the processes? What are the information systems and how we manage those things? So think about those things very early on and think
Would that be the information systems?
That would be the well, we call it architecture and routine. So it would be the whole, how do we organize ourselves to deliver to the customer? And finally, there are two components that are I think quite misunderstood, and other people might think they are fluffy. And again, I always use this analogy of a coin. There are a different sides to the same coin. It's the culture that you want this organization to have, and the leadership style that is required to get this business or to manage that business at whatever cycle or curve or maturity stage that it's on.
And I suppose that's where I want to focus on, because the critical tasks that you've spoken about, the codification of information systems, the ability to have a bird's eye view on the strategy of the business versus how it is operating at an operational level, requires leadership. And I want to focus a little bit on the idea of leadership, because the leadership in most instances would be the founders of a business, right?
Yeah.
And I know that we've had conversations in the past where the mentality of a founder of a business may not necessarily be the right mentality for the person who must manage the business.
Yeah.
How does the founder of the business separate themselves? Because I suppose at the beginning of the business, you've got to play all of these roles as the founder, as the managing director of the business, as the CEO, as the CFO of the business. You've got to be all things. What does the leader, the founder specifically of this business, have to do to be able to segment his thinking that is going to allow the business to be operationally sound?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question, Aubrey. You know, as founders, we develop what I call an ego mentality that says it's either me or nothing else. And for me, this is what typically kills businesses. And you've seen big boardroom fights whenever a founder of a business grows that business to a certain point where it requires a board, and the board is then tasked with now managing this business, and they start quickly having clashes with the founder. I think we've seen it with Twitter, you've seen it with Uber, although it was for other nefarious reasons, but it happens quite a lot. So it's quite important for the leader to be self-aware and understand the purpose of the business. And I know sometimes the purpose of the business cannot be separated from the purpose of the leader. And I say this because there's a distinction between the leader themselves as a person and their purpose and the purpose of that business. Often you find those things to be intertwined and interlinked. But a purpose-driven entrepreneur is less focused with the self and more focused with the change that they want to make in the world. And they will therefore take any necessary step to make sure that that change that is required in the world is realized. So it's very important for leaders to invest in themselves, develop their purpose and the awareness thereof, and always self-check yourselves. And by the way, I do believe without a flinch that any organization that scales to dizzy heights should have those type of leaders behind them. I mean, if you think about big movements in the world, right, Me Too movement, I Have a Dream of freeing by Martin Luther King, or the struggle of liberation in South Africa, are all founded or based on selfless leaders that are willing to mobilize a lot of people behind that dream and be able to groom leaders for the future and be able to get people with different skill sets that are allowing the business to move forward. So if you're interested in that game, that long game, that legacy game, you have to be operating at that level. Otherwise, you'll be boggled in having a finite business that dies with you and does not evolve.
I want us to stop there because I want to take a quick break. But it appears to me that over and above, and again, it's a conversation we've had before, over and above the value proposition of the business, you are introducing a concept that I think needs to be talked about, and that is the purpose. They sound similar, they sound like cousin concepts, but they sound different. That there is the business value proposition, and then there's the purpose of the leader.
Yeah.
And we need to have an understanding of how those interface in order for us to be able to build the organizations that are going to carry all of these wonderful concepts that we're talking about. We continue with that conversation after the break. Please stay with us as we learn how to create organizations and businesses that harbor the right kinds of leadership, that harbor the right kinds of cultures. Straight after this.
The Ntiyiso Consulting Group is an authentically African and globally wide management consulting firm which seeks to empower institutions that enable Africa's development. This impact is delivered through 3 subsidiaries: Ntiyiso Revenue Consulting, Ntiyiso Business Consulting, and Ntiyiso Industrialization Consulting. Our team of over 200 consultants provides sustainable, evidence-based solutions to complex management problems and are subject matter experts in strategy, governance, organizational turnaround, revenue enhancement, and unlocking new economic streams for growth. Visit www.ntiyisoconsulting.co.za for more information. Ntiyiso Consulting Group. Truth, trust, results.
Hello, and once again, welcome to the second segment of the conversation that I'm having with the Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Holding, Mr. Andisa Ramabonga, on this, the third installation of the podcast that we know now as The Truth in Development. We're talking about organizations that have a long-term view. We're talking about leaders that lead those organizations. And one of the things that was said by Andisa Ramabonga was that there needs to be a discrimination, an understanding of the difference between the purpose of the founders of the business and the value proposition of the business, the strategic value proposition of the business. Are they the same thing?
Absolutely not, Aubrey. But before I address that question, there's a point you made earlier that I think we need to probably address around leadership. We are not advocating that leaders eventually leave their businesses.
Right.
I think what you typically want to have
is
that longevity, right? It's quite important to have a stable leadership within a business. But what we are advocating for is that whenever your leadership style does not suit the business, it's time that you find resources, or at least other people that can assist you in taking the business forward. And that's a mark of a good leader, or at least reflect as to say, what is it that you're going to do to change your leadership style so that it suits the context of the business when it's in there. Yeah. So, but I thought
I want to go back to something else that you mentioned earlier on, that I'm now beginning to appreciate. That every business is on an evolutionary trajectory. That every business finds itself at any given point in time at a particular phase of that evolutionary trajectory. And therefore, we need to be able to understand at which phase that business is in order for us to understand what type of leadership is required for that particular phase in that evolutionary
and the type of culture
trajectory and the type of culture.
Yeah.
So it's beginning to make sense to me why you kept on harping on the fact that, listen, remember guys, the business is forever growing. It is maturing, and at each phase of that maturation, we need to understand that there are different requirements.
Yeah. No, spot on, Aubrey. And I'll give you just a simple framework. This is, I'm making it up as but it's influenced by, obviously, my reading. Is you've got the beginning phase where you're thinking about the idea, but you still have not tested it. And you're trying to refine your value proposition and find the market and launch a product or a business. And then you get a phase where I call it the growth phase, where a business starts gaining momentum, starts making sales, starts growing the number of people, starts moving into certain markets. And then I call that, and then the next one is what I call the scaling phase now. A scaling phase, this is where now we are going super big. You're not quite big, but super big. The complexity is growing. Challenges are increasing. You're probably dropping more clients than you're supposed to have. And then what I then call the corporate or the matured phase. I mean, these are in broad terms the cycle that I'm talking about. And it's not everyone, by the way, who needs to be like that. But I guess the business we're trying to address here are businesses that have got the potential to scale. We did say that this podcast is about development, and development is about growing these businesses so that they are big and they're able to accommodate a lot of people in terms of employment.
Hang in there on this idea of scaling. I hear entrepreneurs and people in business talk about scaling. What does it mean to scale?
So to scale is basically to build the necessary infrastructure that will support the growth. Because if you do the growth without building the scale, this is what you typically find businesses declining, right? And let me maybe practicalize it for you. So there's a business that is growing, but it has not codified how it services its clients. And superimposed to that, there's a number of people that are coming in now that do not have that appreciation and understanding of the founding phase of how to satisfy those clients. You find that more often than not, clients' dissatisfaction in that environment grows immensely, and you start losing clients in droves. And obviously, which is tied, by the way, to the strategic conversation we have, we did say that the market ultimately funds the business. And without that market, if it leaves, then that business is bound to fail. So that's what we mean by scaling. I spoke earlier around the need for entrepreneurs to codify certain things around what does the organization look like.
Systems.
That is actually part of scaling.
Yeah.
Because the moment that I said codify this, it means now you're creating rules that you can then enroll other people into. And these rules starts living by themselves without you being there. And it provides ways of recruiting people. It provides ways of policing and setting standards within the organization, and also finds grounds for dismissing people or choosing clients. I mean, it gets complicated because scaling is at different levels. It's on the revenue side. What sort of market segments we spoke about?
Right.
I think one of our shoe manufacturers in the last podcast. You gotta define again that, and you must not take it for granted, because if your market segment is the lifestyle, you don't want salespeople coming in and selling into because it's a waste of effort and money. So it's important that we have these things codified within the business, and that's what provides the scale. So there's a life cycle to a growing a business, and these tools that we are talking about now, even on the past podcast, around about how do you manage and navigate the business throughout that life cycle. But coming back to the concept of leadership, even with leadership as well, you have to superimpose it to that. You'll see that a different leader is required at each and every point in time. You will find more often than not that a founder of a business is actually very good in innovation. They're very good in getting up with ideas and maybe building them. But they're not good with sustaining them, because that one requires a different type of skill set, which is around discipline, which is around marshalling the troops, which are around checking in when people have come or not. Founders typically would like to be at home or at the beach on a laptop, thinking about more grander things vis-a-vis a person who probably needs to be at the office and make sure that the mill is running. And you will quickly see that even the type of culture that's required is different. So if the culture is that of a building culture, you need people who are risk takers. And you need a culture that facilitates or at least is comfortable with risk taking. The trust is probably high. People are experimenting, breaking things as fast as they can because they are trying to create new things that don't exist. Vis-a-vis an organization that's matured, that requires that you conform to standards, you follow the rules. So it's more around command and control more than innovation. And you don't need people going outside the rule book or the prescripts of what you've set in doing a business. And again, this is the same business in a different point in time in the maturity curve. The leadership style that's required is different, as well as the culture. And what you typically find, and this is what organizations typically get incorrect, is that you find the wrong people or the right people for the wrong culture. Maybe that's the word or sentence I must use. You might find that you are bringing innovators in a conformist culture, and you quickly get people who are dissatisfied, you find high churn, and you can't keep people. So it's quite important that we keep in mind as entrepreneurs where we are in the stage of growing business.
Talk to me a little bit about the adaptability of a leader, particularly the founder who is scaling, right? Because what I'm beginning to sense and understand is that the leader needs to have an anticipatory kind of mindset in the designing of the critical tasks of that business, in the designing of the information systems, in the designing of all of those operational issues. That leader needs to be anticipatory, not just reactive. They must also be anticipating things that have not happened yet. And I imagine that that's part of the scaling process so that the business is able to rise to the occasion of growth.
So I think you've just summed up the critical facet of being a leader is being a visionary, right? Because remember, a leader is exactly that, paints a vision and tries to get everyone living in that vision and trying to create that vision as this goes. So you'll quickly see there that there's no, and not by the way to say that we don't have day-to-day fires. At some point you will have to be reactive, but good leaders are in it for the long game. They don't change strategy based on short-term reactionary, market-driven or environmental-driven. You have to adjust to them, don't get me wrong, but you always keep the view of where we are trying to go and play the long game of the business, right? So the vision is a very important part of leadership, because otherwise you're just a manager, not a leader. So the adaptability, again, that's probably the art side of what we are talking about. I did mention, I think in the
science and the art.
Here we are here about the science, and part of it, I think the best we can do with the science is to show you what you need at which stages. And I guess the art side is upon you digesting this and internalizing this information and coming up with strategies that are required for you to evolve. But the saving grace is that we grow with our organizations. You'll find that people, typically leaders, you're not the same person as you were in a corporate, as the same person who founded the business. You tend to grow with the business. You tend to have different experiences. You tend to experience failures. And you develop certain maturities as well as you grow. So that provides at least a bit of a reprieve for a leader to say that the business is not the only one that's evolving. You are also evolving as a person. But it's important to invest in yourself. It's important to seek mentors. It's important to read. A leader who does not read, that organization cannot lead. I mean, that organization is doomed for failure. It's important to keep mentors, I said, or people who've traveled the path, because you are able to then have a sound board. And I hope at some point in time, when we do maybe a season 2 of podcast, because there's a lot of these frameworks we have within the firm that we use more on the personal effectiveness side of building leadership or building a cadre of capable managers of businesses. But we'll hopefully
I don't want you to lose trend of the difference between strategic value proposition and purpose.
Okay, let's get back to that. And it's a good place to start, because I said the leader must have a vision. Remember, a vision is some distant place in the future. We're not quite there.
The big why.
The big why. Yeah. And by the way, we might not reach in this generation that a vision, but it's important that we put in the building blocks to reach there. A value proposition is something subservient to the vision. In fact, you'll find something in between. Organizations will call it a mission. I'm sure you've heard of vision,
the mission statement.
And because the mission is simply answers the question that says, what is it that we are doing to reach a vision? Let me make it a practical example. Ntiyiso Consulting has a mission that says we empower institutions that enable Africa's development. That's what we do. But remember, our vision is something else. Our vision is to say we want to have a developed Africa. Or you can put something grander that says
Wakanda forever.
Africa, we want to remove the third world from Africa. I mean, that could be a vision, right? How we do that would then be our mission that says, okay, for us to do that, and by the way, a vision, remember, starts by identifying that there's a gap between where we are and where we want to be. So in our business, for example, we know the challenges that are facing Africa: lack of development, infrastructure in particular, lack of the formal economy. I'm talking now maybe less so in South Africa, but bigger scheme. But that has got its own advantages as well. That says there's a lot of entrepreneurship. But the question then is to say, how do we scale those entrepreneurship so that we create again a stable economy that employs people? How do we create infrastructure and connect? How do we ensure that the child is learned and has a chance of participating and become an African child in particular, become great in society? So those are all visionary stuff that we have. But as a business, we say, okay, we are blessed with certain skills because we can't solve the entire other people are builders, right? Others are politicians, others are business people. But we are blessed with certain skill sets. That's about thinking about institutions and their growth. And this is our way of contributing to the agenda of a developed Africa. So this is now where the intersection between the purpose of a leader and the founding of a business is started. So we say we empower ourselves, we empower institutions that enable Africa's development. But how do we do that? Then gets the question now of a value proposition. And I'm sure at some point in time we'll talk about it, where we say, okay, we'll help people grow their economies through industrial and identifying catalytic projects and industrialization those. We'll build organizations, and part of what we are talking about is really that capability. We'll build organizations that are resilient and are effective in delivering mandates, right? And thirdly, it's the revenue one that says we'll increase the cash positions of those organizations. No, those are now our value propositions linked to our mission, linked to the vision. So, and more often than not, before I move on to we typically as leaders, and we are not immune, by the way, because that's where we started as well as a business. We start very much at the value proposition stage of the game, right? But it's quite important to be a leader. I said we must be critical and self-aware to always ask the why question. Why am I doing this? Is it a coincidence that I find myself empowering institutions? Or because sometimes it's easy to say it's a coincidence, right? Because I maybe come from a consulting background and having had the fortune of beginning or starting a business. But why is it set up like that? I'm a township child like any other township child. I guess I had probably similar type opportunities to other township children, but we all take different streams in life. And this is where the purpose, again, thing gets through. And it's quite important for entrepreneurs to be spiritually and purpose aware and really ask those hard questions. Because, by the way, it gets you aligning what you are currently doing in life and what contribution you are trying to do to the world. And all those are functions of leadership.
It appears to me that, besides those very big markers, a big vision, a value proposition in the mission, and then all of the things that we've been talking about, that besides that anticipatory way of thinking by a leader, there's also constant reflection.
Yeah.
So there's that forward movement of the mind and the backward movement of the mind all the time. So there's the question that you keep asking that says, why are you doing this?
Yes.
Why are you doing this? And that's the reflective question that you're raising now.
Yeah.
And then there is the anticipatory question that you must be asking all the time. Have I prepared for the answer that comes from the reflection?
Yeah.
That seems to be the relationship of the concepts that live in the leader's mind.
Yeah.
Both reflective and anticipatory almost at the same time. And the answers that come out of that dance between the reflective and the anticipatory are the scaling.
Yeah.
Yeah?
No, absolutely, Aubrey. And there's no right or wrong answer. And I guess this is the beauty about leadership. It's one of those elements that AI can never fully automate, right? But it's I think having the propensity or the hunger to learn and view each and every situation as a learning opportunity. You must be inquisitive as a leader, always asking yourself, but why things are the way they are? What is this telling me? And the other important skills as well is not just to sit on the reflection, right? Because you view that as almost like a sensor to the environment, and always be taking this thing that says, okay, the environment is giving me back an answer. Let me quickly reflect on this and readjust what I need to do and go back to it, because it's only you going back there that you get an affirmation of whether you're doing is correct or not.
Somebody said to me once, and it goes back to that thing that you said in the other podcast, start.
You have to start. You have to be in motion. You have to start.
Absolutely.
And have to be in motion.
And they said to me, if you start, this thing will tell you what it needs.
Yeah.
And that is beginning to make sense to me, that sometimes we don't engage in that conversation, that internal conversation as leaders with the process, because we don't start. If we don't start, then we can't reflect, we can't anticipate, and therefore we can't have these progressive answers coming out as we build this organization. Because I want to remain loyal to the idea that the reason why we're having this conversation is, how do we build the organizations?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That respond positively, not just positively, but with longevity to the value proposition.
Yes.
You are saying to me that you need a vision. That vision is then given impetus by a value proposition that starts the business. But that business has to be led. And it has to be led by people with a vision that are reflective, that are anticipatory, that are inquisitive and curious, all of those things that you've been speaking about. And those are the people that put in systems, that put in critical tasks. And now, all of a sudden, we've got an organization. And that organization must then also be driven and run by a culture. That is what I want to talk about.
So we zoom it in. So at Harvard, they've got this very powerful a triangle that they always refer to. It's called the winning triangle. It's made up of three elements that you continuously need to balance as a leader. And that is purpose, it's strategy, it's culture. So it's quite important that you have these things aligned for your organization.
And I imagine that triangle is the leader.
Is the leader, because purpose is the leader. The culture is the tone that is set by the leader. I mean, culture for me you cannot separate it from the leader. I did mention that even when a business is starting out, you will find more often than not, when the culture is not defined, the values of the leader become so pronounced that the culture of the organization follow that.
I've got to stop you there. I've got to stop you there because we've got to take a commercial break. But I do want us to zoom in on that triangle as we go into the final segment of this conversation. But I'm beginning to realize that this is a dynamic process, ever-changing, moving, evolving, changing process, and that any entrepreneur, any leader must understand that that is what they are signing up for when they want to run an organization that is going to have some level of longevity in the business world. All right. When we come back, we continue with this conversation. We're going to look at that triangle of leadership as we try to understand how do we build organizations that are effective in the carrying out of their mandate, of their value proposition. And I'm really looking forward to this final segment.
The Ntiyiso Consulting Group is an authentically African and globally wide management consulting firm which seeks to empower institutions that enable Africa's development. This impact is delivered through 3 subsidiaries: Ntiyiso Revenue Consulting, Ntiyiso Business Consulting, and Ntiyiso Industrialization Consulting. Our team of over 200 consultants provides sustainable, evidence-based solutions to complex management problems and are subject matter experts in strategy, governance, organizational turnaround, revenue enhancement, and unlocking new economic streams for growth. Visit www.ntiyisoconsulting.co.za for more information. Ntiyiso Consulting Group. Truth, trust, results.
Hello and welcome once again as we continue our conversation around how do we build organizations that respond to their fundamental mandate, that value proposition that we've been talking about. And we were talking about leadership as one of those components. We were talking about culture, and we were talking about, I suppose, a triangle that Andisa Ramabunga had already started to talk about. Andisa, you were already in a particular trend of thought where you were speaking about a triangle and the points of that triangle consisting of what?
Yeah. So I mentioned 3 things that contribute to that triangle. It's purpose, purpose and vision, which are aligned. It's strategy, as well as a culture, because those are important. But take a step back and you'll start drawing the lines. Strategy we've spoken about, how you create, capture, how you create, deliver and capture value, which are those elements, 3 elements: desirability, feasibility and viability. And from the feasibility side, we said there's 4 elements, at least core elements that we need to think about when building an organization. It's aligning works to be done, the people that you need with the right expertise, qualifications and skills and experience, how you structure those people, how do you create routines that support that business, and finally the culture, which is, by the way, the same side of the coin, or the different side of the same coin with leadership. And we went into deep talking about this leadership, and we actually delve deeper to say actually this leadership is again balancing of these 3 things, right? It's purpose and vision and a strategy and culture. But let's zoom into this culture element quite so that we create again the interface. So what are the elements of a very great culture in an organization? Surprise, surprise, it starts with vision. Because vision is the panacea, or the beginning and start of what sort of things we are trying to achieve. And you'll see that it starts influencing the culture.
It's the inspiration.
It's the inspiration, the reason for living. I mean, if the reason we live is to survive, the culture is very different to we want to change and build the world. You understand that already it starts mobilizing people towards a certain point. The other quite important element of a great culture is values. These are I call them unwritten rules about what we do and not do in this environment that does not support the achieving of that
The things that
vision.
we celebrate and the things that we frown
We
upon.
frown upon, yes. And it's quite important that a culture is not a written, or the values, more often than not, you'll find that the values that prevail are not the ones that are written on paper in the corporate offices.
But you did say that operationally, it's important to codify.
Yeah.
In other words, to write down how we do things here operationally.
Operational, yes. No. So again, it gets complicated. Let's maybe stick to values a bit and hopefully not take too much time. There's what we call espoused values and actual values. Espoused values are those values that we want to see, that gives rise to
what we aspire to.
yeah. And then you have the actual values is to actually, that says then what happens in this, what do we tolerate in this environment?
Mthetho wa la ekhaya.
Yeah, mthetho wa la ekhaya, exactly. So what you find with organizations particularly, and funny enough, it's a function of that evolution that we spoke about, is that the espoused values and the actual values, there's a gap. But good organizations, by the way, you find that there's no gap. The espoused values and the lived values, in fact, that's the word I should be using, are the same. And this is where you want your organization to be. But I guess what I'm saying to the leader is putting them on paper and hoping that they translate is not the best way of managing culture, and definitely not best ways of managing values. Okay. And it's quite important to observe more what is lived vis-a-vis what is written. So yeah, codification, by the way, does not then nullify it, if you follow my line of thought, is to say codify those things that you actually want as part of your culture, and that's are very close to your lived values. And by the way, I mentioned this curve. There are things that you can do, or at least frameworks that are available for leaders to try to close that gap between what is espoused and what is lived. But I digress, Aubrey. I think I was still on the second element of what makes a great culture. Started with vision, spoke about values, and we can again have quite an interesting discussion around values and espoused vis-a-vis lived.
You keep emphasizing that it's not the written ones, the
unwritten ones.
Yeah.
If the unwritten ones are the ones that are written, then you have a winning organization. But we're saying pay particular attention to the unwritten behaviors and codes because those are the ones that dictate what we do rather than the written ones. And then a culture obviously is nothing without the people, because the people are the ones that live the values, and the values, by the way, are linked to behaviors, right? And the people are the ones that then personifies behaviors. So people then become the third very important element of a great culture. So you need to have people that can live the culture, that at least aspire or have the propensity to buy into those values and are able to then live them. If you don't have those right people, you'll quickly see that culture becomes toxic, because we do things that are not written, and it goes back to those espoused versus lived values. The fourth thing that is very critical that I always emphasize on is this narrative that we miss as entrepreneurs. And I think I had the conversation with you regarding that. Is to, again, goes back to codification, is to document a story about the business, the narrative about the business that gives it life. I mean, if you can think about organizations that are great, they've got a big story to tell, right? If you think Apple, you think Microsoft, you think IBM, General Electric, there's always that story. Ford Motors, right? I mean, if you think about the industrialization of cars, and there's always that great story. Take it here at home, right? If you
mass
to follow,
production of the internal combustion engine, and so forth.
Henry Ford with the great quote that says, "You can never be remembered on what you are going to do," right? Meaning that we are an action-oriented. So it's important to have a narrative about. And there's a great narrative, I still say, that is untold about In fact, for those who are aware, South African examples of that, SAB has got a very great narrative, and it mobilizes the culture. MTN, I think even Vodacom to a certain extent, are those companies that are, I think, I mean, you think about the mining houses, even the banking sector, all those businesses that have grown have got a great narrative about that story. And it's quite important that we start building a narrative for a business. Because guess what? There are people who come and go. We as leaders already come and go, but it's quite important that we...
Give me a sense of that narrative for Ntiyiso, for example.
So let's document, I call them watershed moments. What are the critical moments that have brought us to this day, to today? Obviously, there's the founding. There's the meeting of the partners. How did the partners date and find each other and start working, right? What happened when they started working, right? And it's always important to document more the behavioral side of things rather than just the outcomes. So we're not interested in the aesthetics, but the deep seated reasons.
Can we have a day on this podcast where we actually tell the Ntiyiso narrative?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's important for people to understand that there's a narrative to this organization that is powering this very podcast.
Absolutely.
And that'll probably give us a sense of the vision and the mission of Ntiyiso in the terms that you're explaining now, in the terms of creating that culture that drives Ntiyiso.
You know, funny, Aubrey, you mentioning vision. By the way, we had a vision statement or mission statement prior to this one that we had. And by the way, that forms part of our narrative. Because again, we tend to fall into this, we get seduced by what other people are doing. So, and you'll see everyone does it, and they actually don't pay particular thought to it. It's easy to put in a brochure. The first thing you do is let me write a mission, and you move on something that you completely don't even understand, mission, vision. And we're no different, same business, we did the same. But I guess what's different with us is we sit and say, but hey, what do we mean by this? And by the way, that's captured in our narrative, beautiful story. It moved on to a very convoluted mission statement that I can't even recall today, to the one that's sitting today, very simplistically, that says we empower institutions that enable Africa's development, right? So part of the narrative, again, and the watershed moments, is to reflect on the points where the business nearly went bust, and what is it that took us out of that, and the points where...
What character traits?
Yeah, what character traits?
What value system?
What value system?
What behaviors?
Right? What behaviors, right? When we started growing aggressively, what other character traits came in there? Where were the challenging moments? Where were the happy moments? Who were part of the story? And what did they bring to the table, whether good or bad?
I like to dabble in DIY.
Yeah.
And I like to go to Chamberlain's. And every time I go to Chamberlain's, there's pictures of the various leaders in their various generations of Chamberlain's. So you see these big pictures of headshots of the various leaders of Chamberlain's. Without necessarily understanding the narrative that you're talking about, I immediately walk into that space and I understand that there's a story here. And what that does to me is that I'm not just buying a pair of pliers, but I'm buying a pair of pliers that has been brought to me by a particular story, a particular experience. And I'm beginning to hear what you're saying when you say that an organization needs to have a story. It's almost like isbong.
Yeah.
Ibongo
are exactly that.
Exactly. It's almost like isbongo neitagazelo of the business.
Yeah.
And what that does is that it gives an identity to this business.
Personality.
A grounding, a personality to this business that makes it a bigger venture than just the creation of material value.
Absolutely.
So, I'm beginning to also sense that this conversation, this podcast, is going to lead us to other dimensions of what makes successful organizations. I'm hearing the whisper of a spiritual conversation around what makes an organization successful. And maybe that's because we're talking about values, we're talking about vision, about the intangibles.
Purpose and spirit are
and
the same
spirit.
thing. Yeah.
It appears to me that over and above the gifts, the skill sets, the experiences, the narrative, there needs to be fuel to this thing that is beyond what you can produce, but what you suck from. I'm interested to have that conversation in a later podcast. But today has been a very interesting discussion, Mr. Ramabonga. And I think that we are moving in a direction that is beginning to make us understand that while entrepreneurs, commercial practitioners are in the business of producing things or ideas or creating values, there's more to this than just skills and things. There's stuff that we are starting to delve into. I want to thank you very much for a frank and very, very, very sagacious conversation. I really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I want to thank you for taking time to listen or to watch the podcast, The Truth in Development, podcast powered by Ntiyiso Consulting Group, conversations that I've been having with the Chief Group Advisor, Mr. Andisa Ramabonga. And I hope that you'll join us next time as we delve into more concepts around business and commercial work. Thank you for joining us.